Okay. All right. On this lecture, in this set of assignments on the problems of public policy, the last class was focused on the goals of public policy, and we'll continue to re reference back to what are we trying to do with any kind of policy, whether it's policy in your family or in your dorm room or in a company or school or a neighborhood or a county or a state, national policy. All forms of policy are trying to improve conditions or develop human capital or reduce poverty. And in so doing, one of the challenges we have is how do you balance trying to have as much individual freedom and choice with what is the fairest thing for the collective, for the group of people. And we're seeing this is Maslow's hierarchy right here again. Same thing we keep coming back to, the things that all humans want. And we find on the left-hand side that the further down on Maslow's hierarchy of things that people need and then want, those things can be bought just by money. So if you have more money, you can have more of these essential things that produces inequality and disparity. You have to manage that. As you move up Maslow's hierarchy of what humans want, these items or these things are not to become less and less things that you can buy. They're things that you have to pursue in different ways than purchasing. But look at the very bottom, it has to do with money. And what we'll come back to over and over again over the course of the semester in looking at different countries is looking at how different countries manage inequality of wealth, how they try to reduce it, and how it gets large and why, and what are the consequences of all that. The assignments for today focus on what happens to any community of any size when you have growing disparities, primarily financial, economic disparities. When the haves get bigger and bigger with their wealth, and a larger segment of the population finds it more difficult to maintain a standard of living to which they've come to expect. And the first article you all read was how this all happened. And I'm going to recap it really quickly, even though you went over it yourself, because it sets, if you know all of this in this really condensed article, it will help you understand so many of our policy challenges in recent years in the United States. And the article starts off by essentially outlining how the war period, World War II in the United States, set the stage for what came after. So during World War II, which got us out of the Great Depression, the Great Depression was lingering on for over a decade, and it wasn't substantially going away. It took a massive mobilization around a global world war that shook off the Great Depression and the economic stagnation and the high rates of unemployment in the United States. So during the war, there virtually is no unemployment. Everybody's working on the war effort, and 10 to 11 to 12% of the US population is serving overseas. And we go into great debt to finance this war. All of those 11 million some odd people come back immediately when the war is over. It's a complete, like, very few of those people stayed where they were. So all of a sudden, in the United States, there was a policy dilemma. What are we going to do with these 11 million people who are going to want homes? They're going to want jobs, and they're going to want to get their life going. What if we don't have jobs for them? What if we don't have homes for them? What if we don't have things for them to come back to? And the United States government made a very conscious policy decision to keep interest rates low, prime the economy, and then to avoid massive unemployment, they did the thing called the GI Bill, which gave all people who served in the war virtually free access to college, extraordinarily low rates of mortgages, interest rates for mortgages. And it basically said to all those people coming home, we'll have things for you to come home to. It may not be a job immediately, although it might, building all these homes and consumer goods that we're going to produce. But immediately you can go to college, you can get more skills. We're going to start building a lot of homes. We're going to give you very cheap mortgages for that. And that set the stage for what happened in the 3 decades after it, from the 1940s to the early 1970s. All of a sudden, people were going to college for the first time and improving their own value, their human capital, and developing their potential, their skills, which enabled them to become better consumers because they were more skilled and trained, and they could buy more, pay more taxes. And then to meet that demand and all the pent up demand, all the things that people couldn't buy, couldn't get during the war because the only thing we were producing was wartime materials. All of a sudden, there was a massive growth in producing things that people wanted: consumer goods, cars, electronics. And we have this massive rise of a consumer society, which keeps the economy going. In fact, the economy grows so significantly from the latter half of the 1940s to the early 1970s. And this is the most important point: in that 3-decade period, this tremendous economic growth in our country is disproportionately concentrated among the bottom 50% of the economic hierarchy. The working poor and the poor saw by far the biggest gains. The wealthy did not cease to be wealthy. The wealthy remained wealthy, but their proportional increase in wealth was very modest. Proportionally, the wealth of this country created was disproportionately concentrated in the lower 50% of wage earners. And that's kind of a really happy story, because enormous wealth was created in the 3 decades after World War II, and it disproportionately went to those who needed it the most, those who benefited the most from it. And you have the rise of this big American middle class who could buy with debt. And this is the other thing the article stresses, that debt becomes something that people learn to live with. Before World War II, and in conjunction with the Great Depression, debt was frightening, and people tried to avoid it at all costs. After World War II, debt, house debt, credit card debt, other forms of credit that allow people to buy now, get now, and then pay off over the future becomes an American way of life. Using debt and using credit and going into debt to buy the things in life: homes, cars, college tuition, vacations, you name it. And it goes on with a few recessions, but it goes on for 3 decades. Profoundly changes the fabric of the United States, changes the expectations of what people have. That if you work hard, apply yourself, you get a middle-class life. That was only the kind of expectation that came after World War II. It was not a pre-World War II approach or philosophy of life. In the 1970s, as the article lays out as well, that whole paradigm buckles and essentially kind of stops. And we have this horrible decade of high inflation, increasing interest rates, and terrible unemployment, and sluggish economic growth called stagnation. It's many factors contribute to it, the biggest being massive increase in oil prices from the Middle East, when the Arab countries are, in a sense, penalizing and punishing the United States for supporting Israel. They just vastly increase collectively the price of oil, and all of a sudden all that money that we have to now pay extra for oil now can't be spent on things in the United States. It goes to Arab countries. That decade killed that old paradigm, the post-World War II to the 70s paradigm of a thriving middle class, using credit, continual economic growth. Didn't work. In the 1970s, it came off, the wheels came off. Ronald Reagan comes into office, and in the first couple of years, jacks up interest rates. His leadership, his administration, the Federal Reserve, increase interest rates dramatically in a punishing way. I mean, it makes borrowing very expensive. It works to effectively kill the poison of inflation, okay? But it comes at a great cost. Huge increase in unemployment in the early 1980s. Some of the highest unemployment rates since the Great Depression. It works in the sense that after that pain is absorbed, interest rates go back down, inflation goes down, and inflation stays down. And midway through the first term of Reagan's presidency, economic growth takes off again, significantly, matching the same sort of level of economic growth that occurred after World War II. But, and this is the big caveat, unlike the great roaring economy from the 40s to the 70s, the big roaring economy from the 80s up to about 2008 with 2 recessions, the difference in this 3-decade economic expansion is it doesn't go to the bottom 50%. It goes overwhelmingly to the top 15, 20, 25% of the country. The wealth of the Reagan up to sort of the beginning of the Obama presidency, the wealth that comes in that period goes to those who are already well off. And why is that important? the real beginning of disparity and economic inequality in the post-World War II era begins during the Reagan administration. And Alan Greenspan, the head of the Federal Reserve, is keeping interest rates low, and a lot of wealth is created, but the wealth is going disproportionately to the people who already had wealth. So the rich did get richer from Greenspan and Reagan on. And that left the rest of the country trying to keep up. The author refers to this as the big stretch. In that more and more people now in the United States have to take out loans to try to maintain the lifestyle that they're accustomed to and that they're emulating from those who are wealthy. So from the 40s to the 70s, the gulf between the middle class and the rich is not that big a gulf in the sense that their lifestyles are recognizable to each other. The rich are definitely living in a higher lifestyle, but it's recognizable to the middle class. From Reagan on, the top 20% and then the 1% at the very top are pulling away faster and faster from the rest of the country. And that forces or leads to the rest of the country taking out more and more debt through extended lines of credit to try to keep up. And it gives rise to this thing we've never had before. You guys can click on this. It's sort of a comedic approach to do it. Should we have billionaires? I mean, should billionaires exist? Because during the Eisenhower Republican administration, tax rates for people who would have had $1 billion they didn't have back then was 90%, right? So before Reagan, the really, really rich people paid really high forms of income tax. And that redistributed wealth back to other parts of the society. From Reagan on, that kind of taxation rates go down, and there's no more 90% tax rates for the wealthy. And that gives rise to the class of billionaires. And maybe it's an ethical argument or a policy argument or just a discussion people have had and have had more since the pandemic, by the way, in which the billionaires have actually increased their wealth, which is, should we even have billionaires when we have 20 to 25% of the population struggling to maintain the two bottom rungs of Maslow's hierarchy, just food, shelter, water, clothing, and safety? The billionaires come out of that Reagan era to the modern era, and then the Reagan Greenspan model of economic growth itself runs ashore in 2008, and that whole paradigm implodes in a massive, massive economic calamity triggered by people taking out loans, mortgages on homes that they can't really finance. They can't keep up with the mortgage payments. And for years and years, they just keep stretching and they just keep making the minimum payment, and the mortgages are minimally kept up to date with. And then, as often happens with any kind of bubble, the bubble eventually is unsustainable. And in 2008, in a very painful, brutal fashion, this economy that was being run on the fumes of a real estate market that had lost its connection to reality. And housing prices kept going up and up and up. And then people were taking out more and more mortgages to then buy those homes and then eventually maybe try to sell them later on. And then eventually there were no more buyers for inflated homes. There's no more people to buy them. And then the people who had them were stuck with them and they couldn't keep up with their mortgage payments. And then they defaulted, and then a lot of people defaulted. Tons of people defaulted. And when they defaulted on loans to banks and other financial institutions that had invested in them, and they invested in them by having other people, like normal people, invest in them through their financial stocks, bonds, and other instruments. And then so the whole economic order collapses. And we're on the verge of another depression. It was that bad in 2008, 2009. That kind of calamity, as the article goes on to show, breeds a growing proportion of Americans saying, this model is not working for me. So on the left, you've got the Occupy Wall Street, Bernie Sanders, AOC model saying this country needs to go back towards more redistribution of wealth and more equity of economic distribution among all the people. And they're furious and they're angry. And on the right, you get the Tea Party, populist Trump crowd that they're really angry. And both groups have strong economic reasons. The economics is what's driving a large part, not all of it. And the author's very clear to say that the anger on both sides is not 100% because of economic conditions. But you can't imagine either one, the Trumpers and the Tea Party, the Trump and Tea Parties and the Occupy Wall Street. You can't understand these two really large diverse groups of angry people without realizing that what's fueling both of them is greater economic disparity and inequality. Here's that decade where it all comes to a gruesome halt. Job growth by decade. You might think, well, were there no jobs created in the 2000s? Yes, there were. Lots of jobs were created from 2000 to 2008. It's just that the 2008-9 recession exploded, canceled out, nullified 20 million jobs. I mean, there was so much job loss in this recession that it took another decade. It took the 2010s to replace all the jobs that had been lost in this 2-year recession. And then, as you also know, as you're following along, all of this great job growth that made up for this hole itself was canceled last spring, 2020, by the economic contraction due to COVID. So what do you have? You've got people who are really, really upset on the left, student loans going up, student loan debt, people who are asking, again, the Bernie Sanders and the Occupy Wall Street crowd are upset. They want a different economic order. And they're saying, this is what he says: you can scoff at linking the rise of Trump on the other side to income inequality alone. And you should. These things are always layers of complexity deep. But income inequality is a key part of what drives people to think, I don't live in the world I expected. That pisses me off. So screw this, screw you. I'm going to fight for something totally different because this, whatever this is, isn't working. And as we saw recently, you had these incredibly angry people storm the Capitol. They're also saying, this isn't working. My guy didn't win. The system is not producing the world I expected. And we need something radically new right now, whatever it is. We've had a lot of that in recent years. This article came out in 2018, so before all this. But all of this is a continuation of what's been going on since 2008 and 9. Just anger on either side of the political spectrum. And then you all watch the documentary that also gives you a nice sort of longer historical analysis of income inequality. And you can see how the U.S. leads this, right? It's one of the most economically unequal countries. And then we have the counterexample of the Scandinavian countries. And I'm just going to use that as a case study today to say there's different ways of managing countries' wealth. And you can do it. You can allow for more inequality and have more extraordinary wealth on one end, but that means you also have extraordinary poverty on the other end. And then another model is Scandinavia, which doesn't allow for huge amounts of wealth to aggregate on one end because they tax that really high. Much higher tax rates in some countries for people who make a tremendous amount of money. That money is then redistributed back to the broad middle. And people have endless discussions about what's a better model, what's a more appropriate model. The important thing for this class is to note they're just different models and they have different results, different trade-offs. And then all of this discussion about income inequality has taken on greater significance since March, April of 2020, 9 months ago or so, because this pandemic that has hit the world has not hit the world equally, right? The wealthy, the billionaires of this planet now have more money than they started the pandemic with. And those at the bottom end, day laborers, gig workers, people who make a living with manual work or daily work have been crushed. So many lower income people can't work because their industry is closed, or no one's buying their products, no one's flying. So people who work in the airline industry can't participate in that part. And the people who work in the airline industry can't have jobs in the hospitality industry, the restaurant industry. Major sources of employment, major sources of our economic growth have been silenced. And that means so many people are struggling to meet the bottom two rungs on Maslow's hierarchy. It's millions of Americans, and who knows, maybe 1 billion or so people on the planet are really struggling with daily physical needs. I mean, essentially survival. Now, in the documentary you watched, Thomas Piketty, who wrote this famous book, Capital, and then he wrote a follow-up called Capital and Ideology, argues, as others are now increasingly arguing, that at the highest income end, you need to have a wealth tax, not just an income tax. You need to tax upwards of 90% of billionaires' wealth. Otherwise, you're going to have riots. You're going to have societies that become unstable, and so much conflict breaks out between the small number of haves and the large number of have-nots that it destabilizes the society we're all trying to live in. That they're, in a sense, at some point, you can allow only so much individual freedom because you've allowed, or the system has allowed, some individuals to amass so much wealth. And there is only so much wealth at any one time, and that there isn't enough wealth left over for the other 70, 80, 99% of the population. Society becomes unstable and potentially violent. And Francis Fukuyama, who's written some very good books on this, argues that in any country that's dealing with these policy issues and inequality, any country has to have three basic set of institutions that allow them to respond to this. If you don't have these, then whatever problems you're facing as a country, financial or public health or epidemiological or otherwise, are virtually unmanageable, because a state is really important. The state is the IRS, courts, city hall, Congress, the presidency, the things that run daily life. They possess a monopoly on legitimate coercion, and they exercise that power over defined territory. These are the things, the public sector, the things that make up a large segment of the stuff with the roads and the schools and the infrastructure. They make that up. And then the state has to have and enforce the rule of law. Ideally, optimally, the rule of law says you all may be different as individuals, you may have different talents, you may have different incomes, different religions, but we need a couple of fundamental things that make us all equal. And one of those is if you speed on a road, no matter if you're Bill Gates or Jeff Bezos or someone who's you've never heard of, you get treated the same. The law treats people the same. It's a really, really important point that undergirds that important concept of equality in a society. People can be different in all kinds of ways, but it gives you that floor, that minimal level of we're all in this together because we all have to play by the same rules, the same law. And then to keep society managing change, you have to have mechanisms of accountability, ways for people to say, excuse me, no, I want a new president, I want a new congressperson, I want a new school board member. There has to be some ways for people to be held accountable, the president, senators, elected officials, anybody who's in a position of power. It can be stockholders voting on corporate C-suite members, the CEO, CFOs, chairman. There have to be mechanisms of accountability where people can say, I like this and I want this to continue, or we collectively, or a lot of us, are fed up. We just had this massive election in this country in November 2020, and it allowed, what was it, 140 million, 150 million Americans to say, I want to express my opposition to the status quo or my support of the status quo. And that's really important, that there are occasional opportunities for people to say, the people in power need to put their record and their decisions out to the public, and for the public to voice collectively whether they mostly support or mostly do not support this. And as you'll see the rest of this class, many countries have this, but definitely not all countries have any of these. The countries that are in the worst shape and the people that suffer the most are in countries that struggle to have any three of these. And then you look at countries that have two of these, and then one is sort of not a part of the package. And then we look at some countries that sort of have a little bit of each of the three, but not enough of them to really be effective in managing the affairs of their country. Just as an interesting note, we mentioned earlier, there's different ways of managing inequality and sort of fostering a collective sense of health. And two of the countries that consistently rank high on happiness and development of human capital, and they have very little, relatively speaking, very low levels of economic and other inequality, are Denmark and Finland. And it's just interesting to note, whenever they do rankings of happiness of the population or human capital development, Scandinavian countries tend to populate the very high ranks, 1 to 10. And just anecdotally, at the University of Richmond, one of the most popular study abroad programs is DIS in Copenhagen, Denmark. And so you can talk to the students who come back from that. They go experience this culture of very little poverty, very little extraordinary wealth, lots of it's 50% tax rate. People pay high taxes, but they get all these services. Healthcare, education is relatively free or College is free once you pass your exams. They have subsidized daycare, subsidized elder care, transportation subsidies, housing subsidies. The things that make up daily living are paid for or subsidized significantly. So people can go about their lives doing whatever they want to do as a job. And they have a lot of freed up time to pursue the things that enrich their lives, the higher levels of Maslow's hierarchy, right? So the best countries, and Francis Fukuyama calls this getting to Denmark, and Denmark's just not, it's any country trying to emulate the kind of governance and the policy and the human capital that Denmark gets in its country. No country, only Denmark's Denmark, but there are things that Denmark and Finland and other countries do that allows a larger proportion of the population to get higher up Maslow's hierarchy. They take care of these completely through taxation and good governance and good provision of all of these physical needs and safety needs. And then that frees up a lot of time for people to pursue these things that really make life happier. And the most recent surveys said Finland, Denmark, number 1 and 2, United States down here at 18. So we have a lot more personal freedom. We have a lot more innovation in some ways. We have a lot more wealth creation at the high end, but it's not broadly distributed. So we have a higher rate of inequality in the United States, and inequality creates, in a sense, more human suffering because they have large numbers of people who have tons of stuff, and you have even larger numbers of people who don't have the basic stuff. There's another graph that shows that we spend the most on healthcare because we spend the least on social services. Scandinavian countries spend a lot on social services, housing, education, healthcare, transportation, the environment. They spend a lot here, and they spend less on healthcare because people are healthier. And so, there's, as this class will show, there's different ways of measuring progress. There's different ways of measuring happiness. There's different ways of measuring and managing your finances in the country and your economy. And how do you manage inequality? How much do you reduce it? How much do you kind of let it go? Because by letting it go, you let other things, you let more innovation occur. So these are trade-offs. So we'll move on to our first case study next class on Japan. But again, this is the goals and the problems of public policy, and one of the biggest ones being, how do you handle economic inequality? How do you manage it? How do you mitigate it? How do you address it? Okay, take care. See you guys.